You lie awake at 3 a.m., replaying conversations from work, imagining worst-case scenarios that haven't happened yet, and feeling your chest tighten with anxiety about tomorrow's challenges. Every day you carry the weight of 1,000 what-ifs that drain your energy and rob you of the joy you know you deserve, while you watch others move through life with a confidence that seems impossible to achieve. I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades helping millions of people transform their lives by conquering the destructive habit of worry. Through my work with over 750,000 students and my research into human behavior, I discovered that worry is not a character flaw, it's a learned habit that can be unlearned. What I'm going to share with you today will revolutionize how you approach anxiety and uncertainty, giving you the practical tools to reclaim your peace of mind and start truly living. The principles that helped business leaders, housewives, and students across America break free from worry's grip are just as powerful today as they were when I first developed them. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to stop worrying and start living. I grew up on a Missouri farm where uncertainty was as common as the morning chores. My father would pace the front porch every evening, calculating whether we'd have enough money to keep the farm through another season. I watched him worry about droughts that might come, creditors who might call, and crops that might fail. Without realizing it, I absorbed his anxiety like a sponge soaks up water. The poverty we lived with wasn't just about empty pockets, it was about empty hope. I remember lying in bed as a 10-year-old boy, listening to my parents whisper about bills they couldn't pay and wondering if we'd lose our home. Those whispered conversations planted seeds of worry in my young mind that would grow into towering trees of anxiety in my adult years. When I finally escaped the farm to attend college, I thought I'd left worry behind. But I discovered something shocking. I had packed it in my suitcase and carried it with me. The night before my first public speaking assignment at State Teachers College in Warrensburg, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with every possible way I could embarrass myself. What if I forgot my words? What if the other students laughed? What if the professor thought I was incompetent? I spent the entire night creating elaborate disaster scenarios in my head. By morning, I was exhausted, terrified, and completely unprepared to do my best work. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had worried so much about failing that I guaranteed my own poor performance. That pattern followed me into my early teaching career. I would lie awake Sunday nights, dreading Monday morning classes, imagining students who wouldn't respect me, administrators who would fire me, and parents who would complain about my methods. I was living in a prison of my own making, and worry was both the warden and the bars. The breaking point came during my second year of teaching. I had worried myself into such a state that I was making mistakes I never would have made with a clear mind. I forgot lesson plans, stumbled over simple explanations, and lost my temper with students who didn't deserve it. The very thing I feared, being a poor teacher, was happening because I was too worried about it to focus on being good at it. One evening, as I sat grading papers with a sick stomach from constant anxiety, I had a revelation that would change everything. I picked up a pencil and began writing down everything I was worried about. The list filled 3 pages. Then I went back through each item and asked myself a simple question. Has worrying about this actually helped solve it? The answer was devastating. Not once. Not a single time had worry improved any situation. Instead, it had robbed me of sleep, clouded my judgment, and stolen my joy. I realized I was spending my life's energy on an activity that produced absolutely no positive results. That night, I discovered something that would become the foundation of everything I would later teach. 99% of what I worried about never actually happened. The students didn't hate me, most of them thrived under my guidance. The administrator didn't fire me. He praised my dedication. The parents didn't complain, they thanked me for caring about their children. I had been living in a world of imaginary disasters while missing the real world of possibility and growth happening right in front of me. Worry hadn't protected me from anything. It had only prevented me from fully experiencing the good things that were already present in my life. Asterisk, asterisk, after my revelation about the uselessness of worry, I became fascinated with understanding exactly what this destructive habit was doing to people. I started studying myself like a scientist studies a specimen, carefully observing when worry struck, how it affected my body and mind, and what patterns emerged. What I discovered shocked me. Worry wasn't just an annoying mental habit, it was a complete physiological assault on the human system. When I worried, my heart rate increased, my breathing became shallow, my muscles tensed, and my digestion stopped working properly. I was literally poisoning myself with anxiety about things that might never happen. I began categorizing the worries that plagued me and my students into 3 distinct types. The first was what I called past regrets, endless rumination about mistakes, missed opportunities, and things I wished I had done differently. I watched myself replay conversations from years ago, imagining how I could have been more clever, more confident, or more decisive. The second type was present troubles, real problems that needed solutions but were being magnified by emotional distress. Instead of calmly analyzing what needed to be done, I would spiral into panic about current challenges, making them seem insurmountable when they were often quite manageable. The third and most destructive type was future fears, anxiety about events that hadn't happened and statistically probably never would. This was where I wasted the most mental energy, creating elaborate worst-case scenarios about everything from my career prospects to my health to my relationships. What fascinated me most was how worry created a mental prison that actually prevented effective action. When I was consumed with anxiety about a problem, I couldn't think clearly enough to solve it. Worry paralyzed my decision-making abilities and clouded my judgment. Precisely when I needed them most, I noticed that the physical toll was severe. During my worst periods of chronic worry, I developed headaches that lasted for days, stomach problems that made eating difficult, and insomnia that left me exhausted. My doctor couldn't find anything physically wrong with me, but I was experiencing very real symptoms from my mental habits. The impact on my relationships was equally damaging. When I was worried, I became irritable, distracted, and emotionally unavailable. Friends and family members began to avoid me because my anxiety was contagious. I was projecting my inner turmoil onto everyone around me, creating the very isolation I feared. Perhaps most ironically, I discovered that intelligent, successful people often worry more than others. This seemed backwards at first, but then I understood why. Intelligent people have active imaginations that can conjure up sophisticated disaster scenarios. They're also often perfectionists who torture themselves over every possible mistake or missed opportunity. I realized that the same mental capacity that allowed me to be creative and analytical was being hijacked by worry and turned against me. My imagination, which should have been helping me envision positive possibilities, was instead creating elaborate anxiety-inducing fantasies about everything that could go wrong. The breakthrough came when I understood that worry is not thinking, the absence of thinking. When I worried, I wasn't actually problem-solving or planning. I was just spinning my wheels emotionally without making any progress toward solutions. Real thinking is productive and solution-focused. Worry is just unproductive mental noise that masquerades as concern or preparation. This realization freed me to channel my mental energy productively instead of destructively. I could use my intelligence to analyze real problems and develop practical solutions instead of wasting it on imaginary disasters that existed only in my anxious mind. Asterisk, asterisk, the night that changed everything happened during my 3rd year of teaching. I was facing what seemed like an impossible situation. The school board was considering budget cuts that might eliminate my position, and I had spent weeks in agonizing worry about my future. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and couldn't concentrate on my work as I sat at my kitchen table at midnight. Staring at another sleepless night ahead of me, I decided to try something different. Instead of letting my mind race in circles, I would approach this worry systematically, like solving a mathematical equation. I took out a sheet of paper and began what would become my formula for analyzing any worry. The first step was to define exactly what I was worried about. This sounds simple, but I discovered that most of my anxiety was directed at vague, undefined fears. When I forced myself to write down precisely what I was afraid of, half my worry disappeared immediately. Instead of "I'm worried about my job," I wrote, "I'm worried that the school board will eliminate my teaching position due to budget cuts, leaving me unemployed with no income and damaging my reputation in the education field." Suddenly, my fear had boundaries. It wasn't an infinite, overwhelming monster. It was a specific situation with defined parameters. This single step reduced my anxiety by 50% because I was no longer fighting shadows. The second step was to determine what was the worst that could realistically happen. Not the catastrophic fantasies my imagination could create, but the actual worst-case scenario based on facts. In my case, the worst that could happen was that I would lose my teaching job, need to find new employment, and might have to move to a different town. This step required brutal honesty with myself. Was I going to die? No. Would I become homeless? Unlikely. I had family who would help temporarily. Would my career be over forever? Other schools were always looking for dedicated teachers. When I looked at the real worst-case scenario, instead of my imaginary catastrophe, it became much more manageable. The third and most liberating step was to mentally accept the worst-case scenario, then immediately start working to improve upon it. This was revolutionary for me. By accepting that I might lose my job, I stopped wasting energy fighting that possibility and started channeling my energy into productive action. I began updating my resume, reaching out to contacts in other school districts, and even exploring alternative career paths that might interest me. For the first time in weeks, I felt empowered instead of paralyzed. I was taking concrete steps to improve my situation instead of just worrying about it. The miraculous thing that happened next surprised me completely. Once I had accepted the worst-case scenario and started taking action, I began sleeping better, eating normally, and performing better in my current job. My improved performance actually made me more valuable to the school board, not less. When the budget decisions were finally announced, not only was my position retained, but I was given additional responsibilities and a small raise. By preparing for the worst, I had positioned myself for the best possible outcome. I used this same formula when I later faced potential bankruptcy in my early business ventures. Instead of panicking about losing everything, I systematically analyzed what would actually happen, accepted that I might fail, and then threw all my energy into preventing that failure. This approach saved my business and taught me that acceptance isn't surrender. It's the foundation of effective action. I shared this method with a student named Margaret, who was torturing herself about her daughter's upcoming marriage. She was worried about everything from the weather to the catering to whether the groom was right for her daughter. Using my formula, she identified her specific concerns, accepted that some things might go wrong, and focused her energy on the elements she could actually influence. The wedding was beautiful, and Margaret enjoyed it instead of suffering through it. This three-step process became the cornerstone of everything I would later teach about worry. It transforms vague anxiety into specific problems, replaces helpless fear with empowered action, and converts worry into productive planning. Most importantly, it gives you back control over your mental and emotional state. Asterisk, asterisk. The most profound lesson about worry came from an unexpected source, a businessman named Frank Bettger, who had lost everything in the stock market crash, but somehow radiated an inner peace that I envied. When I asked him how he maintained such equanimity after losing his fortune, his answer changed my entire approach to life's inevitable setbacks. "Dale," he said, "I spent the first 6 months after my losses fighting reality, and it nearly killed me. Then I realized something profound. I was using all my energy to resist something that had already happened. I couldn't change the past, but I was destroying my present and my future by refusing to accept it." Frank taught me the crucial distinction between acceptance and resignation. Resignation is passive, defeat, giving up, and wallowing in victimhood. Acceptance is active acknowledgement of reality that frees you to move forward productively. When you accept what cannot be changed, you stop wasting precious energy on impossible tasks and redirect that energy toward what you can actually influence. I learned this lesson painfully during my own business struggles. When my first training venture faced serious financial difficulties, I spent months fighting the reality of our situation. I raged against unfair competition, complained about economic conditions, and blamed everyone except myself for our predicament. This resistance consumed enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy while accomplishing absolutely nothing. The turning point came when I finally accepted that my business was in trouble, that I had made some poor decisions, and that external conditions were genuinely challenging. Instead of continuing to fight these facts, I embraced them as my starting point for improvement. Immediately, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I could think clearly again because I wasn't using all my mental capacity to deny reality. Once I accepted our situation, I could see opportunities that had been invisible while I was in denial. I noticed potential partnerships I had overlooked, identified cost-cutting measures that didn't compromise quality, and developed new revenue streams that actually strengthened our business model. Acceptance had transformed obstacles into stepping stones. I began teaching this principle to my students, and the results were remarkable. One woman named Helen had been consumed with bitterness about her husband's death in an accident 2 years earlier. She was spending all her energy fighting the unfairness of his loss instead of rebuilding her life. When she finally accepted that he was gone and that raging against fate wouldn't bring him back, she was able to honor his memory by creating the fulfilling life he would have wanted her to have. Another student, Robert, had been struggling with a chronic illness that limited his physical activities. He had spent years angry about his limitations, which only made his condition worse and his life miserable. When he accepted his health challenges as his reality to work with rather than against, he discovered new passions and abilities he never knew he had. His acceptance didn't cure his illness, but it cured his suffering about his illness. The practice of accepting the inevitable requires daily discipline. Every morning, I learned to identify what aspects of my day were beyond my control, whether other people's moods, economic conditions, traffic, or unexpected complications. Instead of bracing myself to fight these unchangeable elements, I would consciously accept them as part of the landscape I would navigate. This doesn't mean becoming passive or fatalistic. Acceptance gives you the clear vision to distinguish between what you can and cannot change, so you can focus all your energy on the areas where you actually have influence. When you stop fighting unchangeable circumstances, you become incredibly powerful in areas where change is possible. The peace that comes from accepting the inevitable is profound. You no longer carry the exhausting burden of trying to control the uncontrollable. Your nervous system relaxes because you're not constantly braced for battle against reality. Your mind becomes calm and focused because it's not scattered across a dozen impossible tasks. I discovered that acceptance is not a one-time decision, but a daily practice. Every day brings new circumstances that we cannot control. And every day we must choose whether to waste our energy fighting them, or to accept them as the conditions within which we will create our success and happiness. Asterisk, asterisk, for years, I was haunted by a single moment of failure that nearly destroyed my confidence and shaped how I saw myself. During my early days as a traveling salesman, I had botched a presentation to what could have been my biggest client. I stumbled over my words, forgot key points, and watched a sure sale slip through my fingers due to my nervousness and poor preparation. That 15-minute disaster replayed in my mind thousands of times over the next 2 years. I would lie awake at night reimagining the conversation, crafting brilliant responses I should have given, and torturing myself with how different my career might have been if I hadn't failed so spectacularly. I became an expert at reliving my worst moment instead of learning from it. The irony was devastating. I was so busy replaying yesterday's failure that I was creating today's failures. My obsession with that one mistake was making me tentative and anxious in current presentations, which led to more mistakes, which gave me fresh material for self-torture. I was trapped in a cycle of reliving the past and recreating it in the present. I discovered something curious about human psychology during this dark period. Our minds have a strange tendency to replay negative events endlessly while barely remembering positive ones. I could recall every embarrassing detail of my failed presentation, but I struggled to remember the successful sales calls that far outnumbered my failures. My brain was like a broken record player stuck on the most painful song in my collection. The breakthrough came when I realized I was giving that one failure more power over my life than all my successes combined. A 15th mistake from 2 years ago was still dictating my confidence, my performance, and my future prospects. I was allowing my past to vandalize my present. I developed what I came to call my file closing technique. Just as a lawyer closes a case file when it's resolved, I needed to close the file on this mistake. I sat down and wrote out everything I had learned from that failure, how to prepare better, how to manage my nerves, how to recover when things go wrong. Then I literally wrote, "Case closed" at the bottom of the page, and committed to never reopening that file again. Whenever my mind tried to replay that old failure, I would consciously redirect it to the lessons I had learned and the improvements I had made since then. Instead of reliving the mistake, I focused on how it had made me a better salesman. This simple mental discipline transformed my relationship with failure from victim to victor. I shared this technique with a student named Dorothy, who had been paralyzed by guilt over harsh words she had spoken to her mother before her mother's unexpected death. For 3 years, she had replayed that final conversation, adding layers of regret and self-blame that were destroying her mental health and her relationships with her surviving family members. When Dorothy learned to close the file on that painful memory, she was able to honor her mother's memory through loving actions toward others instead of punishing herself with endless regret. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could change what she did with the rest of her life. The mental discipline required to keep your mind in the present moment is like building any other muscle. It requires consistent exercise. Every time I caught my mind wandering into past regrets, I would gently but firmly bring it back to the current moment. What was I working on right now? What opportunity was in front of me today? What could I accomplish in the next hour? I learned that the past serves only one useful purpose: to provide lessons for better decision-making in the present. When we use the past as a source of wisdom, it empowers us. When we use it as a source of regret, it imprisons us. The choice is always ours, but we must make it consciously and repeatedly. The freedom that comes from releasing the past is immediate and profound. When you stop carrying yesterday's burdens, you have more energy for today's opportunities. When you stop reliving old failures, you can focus on creating new successes. The present moment becomes infinitely more rich and promising when it's not contaminated by regret The wisdom that revolutionized my relationship with time came from an unlikely saucer ship captain I met during a transatlantic voyage. As we stood on deck, watching the crew prepare for rough weather ahead, he explained how ships are designed with watertight compartments that can be sealed off if the hull is breached. "You see, Mr. Carnegie," he said, "if we take on water in one compartment, we seal it off immediately. We don't let yesterday's leak sink today's voyage, and we don't worry about tomorrow's storms while we're dealing with today's challenges. Each compartment is separate and secure." That conversation planted a seed that would grow into one of my most powerful techniques for eliminating worry. I realized that most of my anxiety came from either dragging yesterday's troubles into today, or borrowing tomorrow's problems before they arrived. I was living with the burdens of 3 days at once, instead of focusing on the only day I could actually influence today. I began implementing what I called my daytight compartment system. Each morning, I would mentally seal off yesterday's concerns and tomorrow's uncertainties, focusing all my attention and energy on what I could accomplish in the next 24 hours. This simple shift in perspective eliminated 90% of my worry overnight. The mental discipline required was greater than I had anticipated. My mind had become accustomed to wandering freely across past regrets and future fears. Training it to stay in the present moment was like teaching a scattered dog to heel. It required constant, gentle correction. Whenever I caught my thoughts drifting to yesterday's mistakes or tomorrow's challenges, I would ask myself, what can I do about this right now, today? If the answer was nothing, I would firmly redirect my attention to something I could actually influence in the present moment. If there was something I could do today that would affect tomorrow's outcome, I would focus on that specific action rather than worrying about all the variables I couldn't control. My daily ritual became essential to maintaining this discipline. Each evening, I would review the day's accomplishments and challenges, extract any lessons worth remembering, and then consciously close that day's compartment. Each morning, I would identify the most important tasks for the new day and commit to giving them my complete attention without contamination from past regrets or future anxieties. The productivity miracle that resulted amazed me. When I gave my full attention to today's tasks, I accomplished more in 8 hours than I had previously managed in 12. My work quality improved dramatically because I wasn't dividing my mental energy between 3 different time periods. My stress levels plummeted because I was only carrying today's actual burdens instead of an imaginary load from past and future. I shared this approach with a businessman named Charles, who was paralyzed by the enormity of rebuilding his company after a devastating fire. He was simultaneously grieving yesterday's losses and panicking about next year's financial recovery. When he learned to focus only on today's specific tasks, making phone calls, meeting with insurance adjusters, ordering immediate supplies, he began making steady progress that had seemed impossible when he was overwhelmed by the entire situation. Another student, Maria, was struggling with the care of her aging mother while managing her own family and career. She felt crushed by guilt about past decisions and terror about future medical needs. When she began living in daytight compartments, focusing only on today's caregiving tasks and today's family needs, she found peace and efficiency she hadn't known was possible. The compartment system doesn't mean ignoring the future entirely. Planning and goal setting remain important, but they happen during designated times for strategic thinking. The difference is between productive planning and destructive worrying. Planning involves concrete actions you can take today to influence tomorrow's outcomes. Worrying involves anxious rumination about variables you cannot control. I discovered that most future problems either never materialize or are much more manageable when they actually arrive than when we imagine them in advance. By staying focused on today's realities instead of tomorrow's possibilities, I was better prepared to handle whatever actually occurred because I hadn't exhausted my mental and emotional resources on imaginary battles. Living in date-tight compartments requires vigilance but delivers immediate rewards. Each day becomes more productive, more peaceful, and more satisfying when you're fully present for it instead of scattered across multiple time periods. The quality of your attention determines the quality of your experience, and today deserves your complete presence. The wake-up call came at 3 in the morning when I doubled over in excruciating pain that sent me to the hospital emergency room. The doctor's diagnosis was devastating. A bleeding ulcer that required immediate treatment and could have been fatal if I had waited much longer. At 32 years old, I was literally worrying myself to death. "Mr. Carnegie," the doctor said, as I lay in the hospital bed, "your body is showing the classic signs of chronic stress. Your digestive system has essentially declared war on itself because of the constant anxiety you're carrying. If you don't change how you handle stress, this ulcer will be the least of your health problems." That night in the hospital, I tallied up what worry had cost me so far. The financial price was staggering: medical bills, lost work time, and business opportunities I had missed because anxiety had paralyzed my decision-making. But the personal cost was even higher. My wife had grown distant and frustrated with my constant negativity. Friends had stopped inviting me to social gatherings because my worry was contagious and exhausting to be around. I realized that worry wasn't protecting me from anything. It was destroying everything I valued. The irony was brutal. In trying to prevent imaginary disasters through worry, I was creating real disasters in my health, relationships, and career. I was paying an enormous price for a habit that delivered absolutely no benefits. The physical symptoms had been building for months, but I had ignored them or attributed them to other causes. Chronic headaches that made concentration impossible, insomnia that left me exhausted and irritable, digestive problems that made eating unpleasant, muscle tension that created constant discomfort. My body had been screaming for help, but I had been too worried to listen. The impact on my professional life was equally devastating. I had missed several major business opportunities because I was too paralyzed by what-if scenarios to take decisive action. While I was analyzing every possible risk, competitors were moving forward and capturing markets I should have claimed. My worry wasn't making me cautious, was making me irrelevant. Perhaps most painfully, I saw how my anxiety was affecting my marriage. My wife Louise had initially tried to be supportive, but constant exposure to my worry and negativity had worn down her patience and optimism. She began avoiding conversations about the future because she knew they would trigger my anxiety. Spirals. Our home, which should have been a refuge, had become a breeding ground for tension and stress. I watched other families enjoying simple pleasures: weekend picnics, holiday celebrations, evening conversations that had become impossible in our household because I was always mentally elsewhere, wrestling with problems that existed only in my imagination. I was robbing both of us of happiness in the present because I was consumed with fears about the future. The business opportunities I had missed haunted me more than any failure I had experienced. There was the partnership offer I had rejected because I worried about potential conflicts. The speaking engagement I had declined because I feared I might embarrass myself. The investment opportunity I had avoided because I imagined every possible way it could go wrong. Each missed opportunity represented not just lost income, but lost confidence and lost momentum. What shocked me most was realizing that worry had become my primary occupation. I was spending more mental energy on imaginary problems than on real work. I had become a professional worrier, and the pay was terrible. In fact, it was costing me everything I cared about while producing nothing of value in return. The doctor's warning forced me to face an uncomfortable truth. Worry is the most expensive habit you can have. It costs you your health, your relationships, your opportunities, and your peace of mind. Unlike other expensive habits that at least provide temporary pleasure, worry delivers only suffering while disguising itself as prudence or care. That night in the hospital, I made a decision that would change everything. I committed to treating worry like any other expensive habit I needed to eliminate. Just as I wouldn't continue spending money on something that provided no value and caused harm, I would stop spending mental and emotional energy on worry. The cost had become too high, and the returns were non-existent. The recovery process required me to acknowledge that every moment spent worrying was a moment stolen from productive action, genuine relationships, and simple happiness. I couldn't afford this luxury any longer, not financially, not physically, not emotionally, and not spiritually. Worry was bankrupting my life in every meaningful way. The discovery that revolutionized my approach to worry came from observing a simple psychological principle. The human mind can only hold one thought at a time. This sounds obvious, but the implications are profound. If I could fill my mind with productive thoughts and activities, there would literally be no room for worry to take hold. I learned this lesson dramatically during my recovery from the ulcer. While confined to bed rest, I had nothing but time to think, and my mind naturally gravitated toward worry. But when the nurse brought me a complex puzzle to work on, something remarkable happened. For the entire time I was focused on solving the puzzle, I didn't worry about anything. My mind was completely occupied with the immediate challenge in front of me. This led me to develop what I called the law of mental occupancy. Just as a room filled with light cannot simultaneously be filled with darkness, a mind filled with purposeful activity cannot simultaneously be filled with worry. The key was to consciously choose what would occupy my mental space instead of letting worry fill it by default. I began experimenting with different types of activities to see which ones most effectively crowded out worry. Physical work was incredibly powerful when I was completely absorbed in organizing my office, repairing something around the house, or even just taking a vigorous walk. Worry became impossible. My hands were busy, my mind was focused, and anxiety had no entry point. Mental challenges were equally effective. When I threw myself into preparing a speech, analyzing a business problem, or learning something new, worry couldn't compete for my attention. The more complex and engaging the mental task, the more completely it displaced anxious thoughts. But I discovered something even more powerful. Helping other people was the ultimate worry killer. When I focused on solving someone else's problems or contributing to their success, my own troubles seemed to shrink to manageable size. There's something about shifting your attention outward that puts your own challenges in proper perspective. I met a woman named Grace who exemplified this principle perfectly. She had been suffering from severe depression following her husband's death, spending her days replaying memories and imagining a bleak future alone. On her doctor's advice, she began volunteering at a local hospital, reading to children in the pediatric ward. Within weeks, Grace's transformation was remarkable. Focusing on brightening these children's days had crowded out her own dark thoughts. She was still grieving her husband's loss, but she was no longer drowning in despair because her mind was occupied with meaningful activity that helped others. The children's laughter had become medicine for her own wounded spirit. I developed my personal worry-busting action toolkit based on this principle. When I felt anxiety beginning to build, I would immediately engage in one of several predetermined activities. Sometimes it was physically organizing my desk, walking around the block, or doing exercises. Sometimes it was mental working on a challenging project, reading something educational, or planning future goals. Most often, it was service-oriented, calling someone who needed encouragement, helping a colleague with a problem, or working on something that would benefit my students. These service activities were doubly effective because they not only occupied my mind, but also generated positive emotions that were incompatible with worry. The planning and preparation activities were particularly powerful for eliminating future-focused anxiety. Instead of worrying about an upcoming presentation, I would spend that energy preparing for it. Instead of being anxious about a financial challenge, I would research solutions and develop action plans. Productive preparation eliminated worry while actually improving the outcomes I was concerned about. I learned to distinguish between busy work and purposeful activity. Simply staying busy wasn't enough. The activity had to engage my mind and preferably serve a meaningful purpose. Watching the clock or doing mindless tasks didn't crowd out worry effectively, but activities that required concentration, creativity, or problem-solving created an impenetrable barrier against anxious thoughts. The technique required some advanced planning. I had to identify activities that I could quickly engage in when worry struck, and I had to make sure the necessary materials or opportunities were readily available. But once I had my toolkit prepared, I could shift from worry to productive action within minutes. The most profound realization was that I had been fighting worry with the wrong strategy. I had been trying to push anxious thoughts out of my mind through willpower alone, which is like trying to empty a bucket by pushing the water down. The effective approach was to crowd worry out by filling my mind with something else, like displacing water by adding rocks to the bucket. This approach transformed worry from an enemy to be fought into a signal for action. When anxiety began to build, it became my cue to immediately engage in purposeful activity. Worry became the trigger for productivity instead of paralysis, and my life changed dramatically as a result. During the darkest period of my battle with worry, when medical bills were mounting and my business was struggling, I found myself reaching for something I had largely ignored since childhood: prayer. Not because I had experienced some dramatic religious conversion, but because I was desperate enough to try anything that might bring me peace. What surprised me was discovering that prayer could be practiced in two completely different ways with opposite effects. The first type, which I had been doing unconsciously, was prayer as worry. This involved bringing all my anxieties to God, but then continuing to carry them myself. I would pray about my problems, but then immediately return to fretting about them, as if prayer were just another form of worry with religious vocabulary. The second type, which transformed my life, was prayer as surrender. This meant genuinely releasing my concerns to a higher power and trusting that I had done everything within my human capacity. The difference wasn't in the words I used, but in my willingness to actually let go of the burden, instead of just talking about it. The minister who taught me this distinction was Dr. Howard Thurman, whom I met during a particularly difficult period. When I explained my struggles with anxiety despite regular prayer, he smiled knowingly and said, "Dale, you're trying to help God manage the universe. Your job is to do your best work and trust that a wisdom greater than yours is handling what you cannot." Dr. Thurman helped me understand that true prayer isn't about convincing God to solve my problems according to my specifications. It's about aligning myself with a larger purpose and trusting that my sincere efforts will be supported by forces beyond my comprehension. This wasn't passive resignation. It was active faith combined with diligent work. I began developing what I called my surrender practice. Each morning, I would identify the concerns weighing on my mind and consciously place them in God's hands. But then, and this was crucial, I would commit to not picking them up again throughout the day. When my mind tried to return to those worries, I would remind myself that I had already turned them over to a power greater than myself. This practice required enormous discipline initially. My mind was accustomed to constantly monitoring and managing every aspect of my life. Learning to trust that some things were being handled beyond my direct control felt risky and uncomfortable. But the peace that gradually emerged was unlike anything I had experienced through my own efforts. The transformation became apparent during a crisis that would have previously devastated me. A major client cancelled a significant contract, leaving my business in immediate financial jeopardy. Instead of spiraling into panic, I found myself able to assess the situation clearly, take appropriate action, and maintain confidence that somehow this setback would work out for the best. What amazed me was that solutions began appearing from unexpected sources. A former student recommended me for a speaking opportunity that more than compensated for the lost contract. A competitor offered a partnership that opened new markets I hadn't considered. These developments felt less like coincidences and more like pieces of a larger pattern I couldn't see but could trust. I discovered that surrender doesn't mean becoming passive or fatalistic. Instead, it means doing your absolute best work while releasing attachment to specific outcomes. I continued planning, preparing, and working diligently, but I stopped torturing myself about results I couldn't guarantee. This combination of maximum effort with emotional detachment was incredibly liberating. For those who struggled with traditional religious concepts, I found that the same benefits could be achieved through what I called cosmic trust. This involved recognizing that human beings are part of something much larger than themselves, whether they called it God, the universe, natural law, or simply the interconnectedness of all life. The key was releasing the illusion that any individual controls all the variables affecting their life. The practical techniques I developed could be adapted to any spiritual framework. The morning surrender practice involved identifying current worries and consciously releasing them to whatever higher power felt authentic. The evening gratitude practice involved acknowledging the day's blessings and unexpected assistance. The moment-by-moment practice involved catching myself when I tried to control outcomes beyond my influence. What I learned was that prayer and surrender weren't escapes from reality. They were ways of engaging with reality more effectively. When I stopped wasting energy on impossible control efforts, I had more energy available for productive action. When I trusted that my sincere efforts would be supported, I could take bigger risks and pursue more ambitious goals. The peace that comes from genuine surrender is qualitatively different from any calm you can achieve through your own efforts. It's not dependent on circumstances being favorable or problems being solved. It's a deep knowing that you're part of something larger that's ultimately trustworthy, even when you can't understand how all the pieces fit together. This spiritual dimension of worry elimination became the foundation that supported all my other techniques. Without it, my methods were helpful but limited. With it, they became transformational because they were rooted in something deeper than just psychological strategies. They were connected to the fundamental trust that makes fearless living possible. The library became my sanctuary during the worst period of my anxiety, not for escape, but for rebuilding my mental foundation with thoughts that generated peace instead of turmoil. I discovered that just as you can poison your mind with worry, you can heal it by deliberately feeding it peaceful, empowering ideas. The breakthrough came when I realized that my mind had become a repository of fearful thoughts, worst-case scenarios, and anxiety-producing beliefs. I had been unconsciously collecting mental poison for years, and now I needed to consciously build a collection of mental medicine. I began what I called my peace library books, passages, quotes, and ideas that restored my inner calm when anxiety threatened to overwhelm me. The first book that truly helped was Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Here was a man who ruled an empire during times of war and plague, yet maintained inner tranquility through philosophical discipline. His thoughts became my thoughts. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength when worry struck. I would repeat this until my mind regained its balance. Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays provided another source of peace-inducing wisdom. His belief that we are part of a larger, benevolent universe helped counter my tendency to see myself as isolated and vulnerable. "Nothing can bring you peace but yourself," he wrote. And I began to understand that peace was not something I had to wait for circumstances to provide. It was something I could generate from within. I developed the practice of memorizing passages that particularly resonated with me. When my mind tried to spiral into worry, I would deliberately recite these memorized pieces of wisdom instead. It was like having a first aid kit for mental emergencies, immediate access to thoughts that could stop anxiety in its tracks and redirect my mind toward peace. One passage that became particularly powerful for me was from the Bible. "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." This simple wisdom reinforced everything I was learning about living in day-tight compartments and trusting that today's challenges were sufficient without borrowing tomorrow's troubles. But I didn't limit myself to ancient wisdom. I collected contemporary examples of people who maintained peace under pressure. Stories of individuals who faced adversity with grace became mental models I could reference when facing my own challenges. If they could maintain inner calm during genuine crises, surely I could do the same with my largely imaginary troubles. The practice of reading peaceful literature became a daily discipline, like taking medicine for my mental health. Each morning, I would spend at least 15 minutes filling my mind with thoughts that generated calm, confidence, instead of anxious worry. This wasn't passive reading, it was active programming of my mental state for the day ahead. I also began keeping a journal of peaceful thoughts and insights that occurred to me throughout the day. When I noticed myself feeling particularly calm or confident, I would write down what I was thinking at that moment. Over time, I built a personal collection of peace-inducing thoughts that I could return to whenever I needed them. Music became another powerful tool for generating peaceful mental states. I discovered that certain pieces of classical music could instantly shift my mood from anxious to serene. I would play these pieces while reading my peaceful literature, creating a multisensory experience that deeply embedded these calming influences in my mind. The most important discovery was that what you feed your mind determines your emotional state as surely as what you feed your body determines your physical health. If you constantly consume news about disasters, gossip about problems, and entertainment focused on conflict, your mind will generate anxiety and negativity. If you feed it wisdom, beauty, and uplifting ideas, it will generate peace and confidence. I learned to be as selective about my mental diet as I was about my physical diet. I stopped reading sensational newspapers that thrived on creating anxiety about events I couldn't influence. I avoided conversations with chronically negative people who seemed determined to share their worries with everyone around them. I chose entertainment that uplifted rather than disturbed my peace of mind. This didn't mean ignoring reality or avoiding all challenging information. It meant being intentional about the balance between necessary information and unnecessary mental pollution. I could stay informed about important developments without marinating my mind in anxiety-producing content that served no constructive purpose. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. My default mental state shifted from anxiety to calm expectancy, instead of automatically assuming the worst about uncertain situations. I began expecting positive outcomes while remaining prepared to handle challenges constructively. My mind became a source of peace rather than a generator of worry. Creating your personal peace library requires intentional effort, but the investment pays dividends every day for the rest of your life. When you have easy access to thoughts that generate tranquility, you're never more than a few minutes away from inner peace, regardless of external circumstances. You become your own best friend instead of your own worst enemy. The business failure that nearly destroyed my confidence taught me the most valuable lesson of my entire career. I had invested everything, my savings, my reputation, and 18 months of intensive work into a training program that completely flopped. The venture lost money, disappointed clients, and left me questioning my abilities as an educator and entrepreneur. For weeks after the failure, I tortured myself by replaying every decision that had led to the disaster. I analyzed each mistake obsessively, imagining how different choices might have produced success. I became an expert at sawing sawdust, trying to cut up something that was already cut, attempting to change something that was already done, reliving the past as if my mental anguish could somehow alter what had already happened. The wake-up call came from an old carpenter I hired to repair some damage in my office. As I watched him work, I mentioned my tendency to rehash past mistakes. He stopped sawing, looked at me with weathered wisdom, and said, "Son, you can't saw sawdust. Once the wood is cut, it's cut. You can use the sawdust for something else, or you can sweep it up and throw it away, but you sure can't saw it again." That simple metaphor revolutionized my approach to failure and mistakes. I realized I had been trying to saw sawdust, attempting to recut decisions that were already made, replay conversations that were already finished, and redo actions that were already completed. This mental activity was not only useless, but actively harmful because it prevented me from focusing on what I could actually influence. I developed a systematic approach to learning from mistakes without dwelling on them destructively. First, I would analyze what had gone wrong, but with a specific purpose, extracting lessons that would improve future decisions. This was productive analysis, mining the experience for wisdom rather than wallowing in regret. Second, I would identify specific changes I would make if faced with similar situations in the future. This transformed the failure from a source of shame into a source of knowledge. The pain of the mistake became the price I paid for education that would serve me for the rest of my career. Third, and most importantly, I would consciously close the file on that particular failure, just as the carpenter swept up his sawdust and moved on to the next project. I would gather the lessons from my mistake and then deliberately stop revisiting the failure itself. The learning was complete. The self-torture was over. The transformation in my business success was immediate and dramatic. Instead of being paralyzed by fear of repeating past mistakes, I became confident in my ability to handle whatever challenges arose because I had systematically learned from every previous failure. My mistakes had become my teachers rather than my tormentors. I shared this approach with a student named Patricia, who had been devastated by a divorce she felt was entirely her fault. She spent months analyzing every argument, every moment of neglect, every opportunity for better communication that she had missed. She was expertly sawing sawdust while her present life deteriorated from lack of attention. When Patricia learned to extract the relationship lessons from her marriage without continuing to relive its failures, she was able to focus on building better relationships in the present. She couldn't change what had happened with her husband, but she could use what she had learned to create healthier connections with friends, family members, and eventually a new romantic partner. The questions I learned to ask transformed my relationship with failure completely. Instead of "Why did I make such a stupid mistake?" I would ask, "What can this teach me?" Instead of "How could I have been so blind?" I would ask, "What warning signs should I watch for in the future?" Instead of "I'm such a failure," I would say, "I'm becoming more skilled through experience." This approach required genuine discipline because the mind naturally gravitates towards self-punishment after mistakes. There's something perversely satisfying about mental self-flagellation that can become addictive. Breaking this pattern meant consciously redirecting my mental energy from destructive rumination to constructive learning. I discovered that most successful people have made more mistakes than unsuccessful people, not fewer. The difference is that successful people use their mistakes as stepping stones, while unsuccessful people use them as excuses to stop trying. The sawdust from their failures becomes the foundation for their eventual success. The freedom that comes from learning to stop sawing sawdust is immediate and profound. When you extract wisdom from your mistakes without wallowing in them, you become confident rather than tentative, forward-looking rather than backward-focused, and optimistic rather than defeated. Your past becomes a source of strength rather than a source of shame. Every mistake contains valuable information, but only if you mine it properly, rather than drowning in it emotionally. The goal is to become a better decision-maker through experience, not to punish yourself for being human and imperfect. Sawdust can't be sawed again, but it can fertilize the ground where your future success will grow. Asterisk, asterisk. The disaster that accidentally launched my speaking career began as my worst nightmare. I had been invited to give a presentation to the YMCA board about my teaching methods, and I was determined to make a perfect impression. I prepared meticulously, memorized every word, and rehearsed until I felt completely confident. But when the moment arrived, everything went wrong. The microphone failed, my carefully prepared notes were soaked by a spilled water glass, and in my nervousness, I completely forgot my memorized speech. Standing before 50 influential men, I faced a choice: flee in humiliation or adapt to the disaster. In desperation, I abandoned my formal presentation and simply told them stories, real stories about my students, their struggles, and their breakthroughs. I spoke from my heart instead of my notes, sharing genuine experiences instead of polished rhetoric. When I finished, the room erupted in the most enthusiastic applause I had ever received. That speaking disaster taught me that authenticity resonates more powerfully than perfection. The very failure that I thought would end my speaking opportunities actually revealed my true strength as a communicator. What seemed like my worst professional moment became the foundation of my life's work, helping others find their authentic voices. This experience introduced me to a principle that would transform how I viewed every setback. Every apparent failure contains the seeds of unexpected success, but only if you're willing to look for them and nurture them. Most people focus so intently on the obvious disappointment that they miss the hidden opportunity emerging from the same situation. I developed what I called my benefit analysis system for dealing with setbacks. Whenever something went wrong, I would force myself to identify at least 3 potential benefits that could emerge from the situation. This wasn't naive optimism, it was strategic opportunity recognition. Sometimes the benefits were immediate and obvious. Other times they took months or years to materialize. When my first business partnership dissolved in bitter conflict, I initially saw only failure and betrayal, but forcing myself to find benefits in the situation revealed several hidden advantages. I learned valuable lessons about choosing partners more carefully. I discovered I could run a business independently, and I was freed from a relationship that was limiting my growth. The painful breakup actually accelerated my professional development. I met a remarkable woman named Eleanor, whose story perfectly illustrated this principle. When her husband died unexpectedly, leaving her with 3 young children and no business experience, she faced what seemed like an impossible situation. Instead of succumbing to despair, she analyzed what opportunities might exist within her tragedy. Her husband had been a talented photographer who had always dreamed of opening a portrait studio but never found the courage to leave his secure job. Eleanor realized she could honor his memory while supporting her family by turning his dream into reality. Using his equipment and the photography skills he had taught her, she opened the studio he had always envisioned. The business thrived because Eleanor brought something to photography that technical skill alone couldn't provide: genuine empathy for families facing difficult times. Her own experience with loss gave her the ability to capture the love and connection in family portraits with unusual depth and sensitivity. What began as devastating loss transformed into meaningful work that served her community while providing well for her children. The key to this transformation was Eleanor's willingness to ask different questions. Instead of "Why did this terrible thing happen to me?" she asked, "How can I use this experience to create something meaningful?" Instead of "What have I lost?" she asked, "What unique gifts might emerge from this situation?" I learned to approach every setback with what I called opportunity scanning. When faced with disappointment, I would systematically consider how this change might redirect me towards something better than what I had originally planned. Sometimes forced changes led to opportunities I never would have discovered if my original plans had succeeded. The business failure that nearly bankrupted me eventually led to my most successful venture. When my elaborate training program flopped, I was forced to strip away everything except the most essential elements. This simplification revealed the core principles that really mattered, which became the foundation for a much more effective and profitable approach. Recovery from serious illness taught me to value health and energy in ways I had never appreciated before. A professional rejection redirected me toward opportunities that were much better suited to my actual talents. A friendship that ended painfully freed me from a relationship that was draining my confidence and limiting my growth. The practice of turning lemons into lemonade requires both patience and creativity. Sometimes the benefits of a setback aren't immediately apparent. You may need to hold space for the possibility that something good is emerging while taking practical steps to address immediate challenges. The lemonade doesn't appear instantly when life hands you lemons. You have to actively make it. This approach doesn't mean pretending that setbacks aren't painful or that every loss automatically becomes a gain. It means maintaining confidence that human beings have the capacity to create meaning and opportunity from even the most difficult circumstances. When you believe that every experience can become useful, you become virtually unstoppable because nothing can defeat you permanently. The attitude that every setback contains hidden opportunities transforms you from a victim of circumstances into a collaborator with life's unexpected turns. Instead of fighting change, you learn to dance with it, finding rhythm and grace even in difficult transitions. Asterisk. The revelation that changed my entire approach to happiness came during a conversation with a janitor at one of the schools where I taught. While I was complaining about my modest salary and uncertain career prospects, this man who earned a fraction of what I radiated, a contentment and joy that I envied. When I asked him about his secret, his answer stunned me. "Mr. Carnegie," he said with a genuine smile, "I learned a long time ago that happiness isn't something you wait for, it's something you create. Every morning I wake up and decide to find something good about this day, and I always do. Happiness is a choice, and I choose it." That simple wisdom shattered my assumptions about what creates happiness. I had been waiting for external conditions to improve before I would allow myself to be happy. I thought I needed more money, a better job, perfect health, and ideal relationships before I could experience genuine contentment. This janitor taught me that I had it backwards. Happiness creates better external conditions, not the other way around. I began studying happy people systematically, trying to understand what they did differently from chronically unhappy people. What I discovered was revolutionary. Happy people don't have better circumstances. They have better habits of thought and action. They actively cultivate joy instead of passively waiting for it to arrive. The first habit I learned was the practice of gratitude, appreciation. Happy people notice and acknowledge good things that others take for granted. They appreciate their health when they're not sick, their relationships when they're not in conflict, and their basic comforts when they're not in crisis. This isn't naive optimism, it's intelligent recognition of actual blessings that exist. In every life, I started keeping what I called a daily blessing inventory. Each evening, I would write down at least 5 things I was grateful for from that day. Sometimes they were significant events, but more often they were small pleasures I had previously overlooked. Friendly conversation, a beautiful sunset, a good meal, a problem solved, a moment of peace. This practice completely transformed my emotional baseline. Instead of focusing on what was wrong or missing in my life, I began noticing what was right and present. This shift in attention created a shift in emotion from dissatisfaction to appreciation, from scarcity to abundance, from complaint to gratitude. The second habit was what I called joy generation through service. Happy people regularly do things for others without expecting anything in return. This isn't sacrifice, it's intelligent selfishness, because making others happy consistently makes you happy. There's something about shifting your focus from getting to giving that opens up wellsprings of contentment. I began looking for small ways to brighten other people's days. Genuine compliments, unexpected help with tasks, listening attentively when someone needed to talk, sharing encouraging words during difficult times. These actions required minimal effort but generated maximum happiness for both the recipient and myself. One of my students, a businessman named Robert, perfectly illustrated this principle. He had been chronically unhappy despite considerable material success until he began volunteering to read to children at a local orphanage. The joy on those children's faces when he arrived each week filled him with happiness that no business achievement had ever provided. Making others happy had become his most reliable source of personal happiness. The third habit was creating daily moments of genuine pleasure. Happy people don't wait for special occasions to enjoy life. They find reasons to celebrate ordinary moments. They savor good food, appreciate beautiful music, enjoy conversations with friends, and take pleasure in simple accomplishments. I learned to consciously create what I called happiness anchors throughout each day. A few minutes listening to music I loved, a walk in nature, a conversation with a friend, reading something inspiring, or simply sitting quietly and appreciating the moment. These small pleasures became powerful antidotes to stress and worry. The fourth habit was maintaining what happy people called emotional independence. They didn't make their happiness dependent on other people's moods, opinions, or behaviors. They remained friendly and caring, but they didn't allow external negativity to contaminate their inner peace. They had learned to generate happiness from within rather than extracting it from circumstances. This was perhaps the most challenging habit to develop because it required taking full responsibility for my emotional state. I could no longer blame my unhappiness on other people's actions, disappointing events, or unfavorable circumstances. I had to accept that my happiness was my responsibility and my choice. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. As I became more consistently happy, people began seeking out my company. Business opportunities increased because clients enjoyed working with someone who brought positive energy to every interaction. My relationships improved because I was contributing joy rather than draining it. Most surprisingly, my external circumstances actually did improve as I became happier. Not because happiness magically changed the world around me, but because happy people make better decisions, take more positive risks, and attract more opportunities. Happiness became both the means and the end, the path to better life conditions, and the reward for walking that path. The secret I learned from that wise janitor was that happiness is not a destination you arrive at when everything goes perfectly. It's a way of traveling through life that makes every journey more enjoyable and every destination more satisfying. You don't have to wait for permission to be happy. You can choose it right now, regardless of your circumstances. Asterisk, asterisk, the attack came without warning and was more vicious than anything I had experienced in my professional life. A respected education journal published a scathing review of my teaching methods, questioning my qualifications, ridiculing my approach, and suggesting that I was a charlatan preying on desperate people. The criticism was personal, brutal, and very public. My initial reaction was devastation. I felt humiliated, angry, and tempted to abandon my work entirely. How could I continue teaching when such respected authorities were publicly declaring me a fraud? For days, I wallowed in self-pity and seriously considered returning to the safety of traditional employment, where no one would scrutinize my methods or question my value. But then I remembered something my father had told me years earlier when neighbor kids were teasing me about our family's poverty. "Son, remember that no one kicks a dead dog. If they're coming after you, it means you're alive and moving and making a difference. Dead dogs just lie there, ignored." That wisdom hit me like lightning. This brutal criticism wasn't evidence of my failure, it was evidence of my impact. If my work was meaningless and my influence negligible, why would anyone bother to attack it? The very fact that respected critics felt compelled to write about my methods meant that those methods were getting attention and creating change. Began researching the backgrounds of my critics and made a startling discovery. The harshest criticism was coming from people whose own approaches I was inadvertently challenging. My emphasis on practical application over theoretical knowledge threatened educational traditionalists. My focus on building confidence, rather than just imparting information, challenged conventional teaching wisdom. The criticism wasn't really about the quality of my work, it was about the threat my success posed to established methods. I was being attacked not because I was ineffective, but because I was too effective in ways that made others' approaches look outdated. This realization transformed my shame into something approaching pride. I developed what I called my criticism filter to distinguish between useful feedback and destructive attacks. Constructive criticism offers specific suggestions for improvement and comes from people genuinely interested in helping you succeed. Destructive criticism makes personal attacks, offers no solutions, and often comes from people whose interests you're threatening. When criticism passed through my filter as potentially useful, I would analyze it carefully and implement any valid suggestions. When it was clearly destructive, I would remind myself that it was actually a compliment disguised as an insult, evident that my work was significant enough to provoke strong reactions. I shared this perspective with a student named Margaret, who was being maliciously gossiped about by former friends after her business began succeeding. They were spreading rumors about her methods, questioning her integrity, and trying to undermine her reputation. Margaret was devastated until she realized that their attacks were actually driven by envy of her success. "They never talked about me when I was struggling," Margaret observed. "Now that I'm thriving, suddenly they can't stop discussing my business." The criticism hurts, but it also means I'm doing something significant enough to warrant their attention. This realization freed Margaret to focus on her work instead of defending herself against every petty attack. She understood that some criticism would always accompany success, and that trying to please everyone would guarantee pleasing no one effectively. I learned to use criticism as a gauge of my impact and influence. When I was teaching traditional methods and staying safely within conventional boundaries, no one criticized me, and no one particularly noticed me either. As my methods became more innovative and my influence grew, criticism increased proportionally. The most valuable insight was understanding that criticism often reveals more about the critic than the target. People who are secure in their own success don't feel threatened by others' achievements. Those who attack most viciously are often those who feel most inadequate in comparison. This doesn't mean becoming arrogant or dismissive of all feedback. It means developing enough confidence in your value and purpose that you can't be derailed by those who would rather tear you down than build themselves up. Thick skin becomes essential armor for anyone who wants to accomplish anything significant. I also discovered that public criticism often generates unexpected support. When my harshest critics published their attacks, dozens of students and colleagues came forward to defend my work and share their positive experiences. People who had been quietly appreciating my methods suddenly became vocal advocates when they saw me being unfairly attacked. The controversy actually increased my visibility and credibility among people who mattered most, those who needed the help I was offering. Many potential students first heard about my work through the criticism, investigated for themselves, and became enthusiastic participants. My critics had inadvertently become my unpaid marketing team. I learned to respond to criticism with grace rather than defensiveness. When attacked, I would acknowledge any valid points, ignore personal insults, and continue focusing on serving those who valued my work. This dignified response often made my critics look petty while making me appear confident and secure. The freedom that comes from understanding that criticism is often a compliment is profound. When you know that being attacked means you're making a difference, you can maintain confidence and continue your important work regardless of what others say. Remember, no one kicks a dead dog, so if they're kicking you, you must be very much alive and making an impact worth noticing. Asterisk, asterisk, I hated teaching when I first started. The long hours, modest pay, and constant pressure to control unruly students made each day feel like a prison sentence I had to endure. I would lie awake Sunday nights, dreading Monday morning, counting the years until I could escape to something more lucrative and prestigious. Teaching felt like a temporary detour on my way to real success. The transformation began when I stopped seeing my students as obstacles to endure and started seeing them as individuals to understand. Instead of focusing on what I didn't like about teaching, I began paying attention to moments when the work felt meaningful and satisfying. What I discovered surprised me completely. There was genuine magic in watching a shy student gain confidence through public speaking practice, real satisfaction in helping someone overcome a fear that had limited them for years, deep fulfillment in knowing that my guidance might change the trajectory of someone's entire life. These moments had always been there. I had just been too focused on my complaints to notice them. I realized that my unhappiness wasn't really about teaching itself, but about my attitude toward teaching. I had been approaching my work as something I had to do, rather than something I chose to do. This subtle shift in perspective, from obligation to opportunity, changed everything about my daily experience. I began what I called my joy archaeology, deliberately searching for sources of satisfaction within my current work instead of waiting for different work to provide satisfaction. Every job contains elements that can generate genuine fulfillment, if you're willing to look for them and cultivate them. The breakthrough came when I started viewing my teaching not as knowledge transmission, but as life transformation. Instead of just covering curriculum, I was helping people develop skills that would serve them for decades. Instead of just managing classrooms, I was creating environments where growth and confidence could flourish. This new perspective transformed my energy and effectiveness. Students responded to my increased enthusiasm with greater engagement. Parents noticed the positive changes in their children and spread word about my classes. Administrators recognized my improved results and offered additional opportunities. When I started loving what I did became more lovable. But I also learned that sometimes you need to create the work you love rather than waiting for it to appear. My transition from traditional teaching to public speaking instruction happened because I identified what I was most passionate about and found ways to do more of it. I didn't abandon teaching, I evolved it toward what energized me most. I met a remarkable woman named Sarah who perfectly illustrated this principle. She was trapped in an accounting job that drained her spirit, but she had financial responsibilities that made career change seem impossible. Instead of resigning herself to misery, Sarah began looking for ways to incorporate her true passion, helping women start businesses, into her existing work. She started offering free financial planning workshops for female entrepreneurs on weekends. This small step led to consulting opportunities, which eventually grew into a thriving practice, helping women launch successful businesses. Sarah hadn't immediately quit her accounting job. She had gradually built the work she loved, while maintaining financial stability. The key insight was that you don't have to choose between practical necessity and personal fulfillment. You can often find ways to bring more meaning and joy into your current situation, while developing pathways toward work that aligns more completely with your passions. I developed a systematic approach for this transformation. First, identify what aspects of your current work genuinely energize you, even if they're small parts of the overall job. Second, look for ways to expand these energizing elements while minimizing the draining aspects. Third, explore how your natural interests and talents might be applied in new ways within your current field or adjacent fields. Fourth, start developing skills and connections related to your ideal work while maintaining your current income source. Fifth, create small experiments that allow you to test whether your passions can become profitable pursuits. Finally, make gradual transitions that minimize risk while maximizing growth toward work you truly love. This approach requires patience and strategic thinking, but it's much more sustainable than dramatic career changes that often fail due to inadequate preparation or financial pressure. You can love your work more immediately by changing your approach to it, while simultaneously building toward work you'll love even more. I discovered that meaningful work isn't just about finding the perfect job, it's about bringing purpose and passion to whatever work you do. When you approach any job with the intention of serving others, developing your abilities, and contributing something valuable to the world, that work becomes inherently meaningful regardless of its title or status. The most important realization was that loving your work isn't a luxury reserved for the fortunate few. It's a skill that can be developed by anyone willing to shift their perspective and take gradual action toward alignment between their values and their daily activities. When you do what you love, work becomes play. When you love what you do, even challenging work becomes satisfying. The goal isn't to eliminate all difficulty from your work life, but to ensure that the difficulties you face are in service of something you find genuinely meaningful and fulfilling. That makes all the difference between drudgery and joy. Asterisk. The war with myself had been raging for so long that I couldn't remember when it started. Every morning I would look in the mirror and catalogue my deficiencies. Not handsome enough, not tall enough, not confident enough, not successful enough. I was my own harshest critic, most relentless enemy, and most destructive influence. The voice in my head never missed an opportunity to remind me of my inadequacies. This internal criticism was exhausting and counterproductive. How could I build confidence in others when I was constantly tearing myself down? How could I teach self-improvement when I couldn't accept myself as I was? The contradiction between my public message and my private self-talk was creating enormous stress and undermining my effectiveness. The turning point came during a conversation with my mentor, Dr. William James, who noticed my tendency toward self-deprecation during our discussions. When I made another dismissive comment about my abilities, he stopped me with a question that changed everything. Dale, would you talk to any of your students the way you talk to yourself? The answer was shocking. Absolutely not. I would never dream of speaking to another person with the cruelty, constant criticism, and harsh judgment I directed toward myself daily. I had somehow convinced myself that self-criticism was motivating when it was actually devastating. I was treating myself worse than I would treat a stranger. Dr. James helped me understand that self-criticism doesn't prevent the insecurity it pretends to address. It creates and reinforces that insecurity. Every time I told myself I wasn't good enough, I was programming my subconscious to believe that message. I was literally training myself to feel inadequate and insecure. I began developing what I called my self-friendship practice. If I could learn to treat myself with the same kindness, patience, and encouragement I offered to my students, I could transform my inner experience completely. This didn't mean becoming delusional about my limitations. It meant acknowledging them without self-assault. The first step was becoming aware of my internal dialogue. I was shocked to discover how constantly and viciously I criticized myself. Throughout the day, comments about my appearance, my performance, my decisions, and my worth streamed through my mind like a toxic river of negativity. No wonder I felt anxious and insecure. I was living with an abusive roommate inside my own head. I started treating my self-critical thoughts like unwelcome guests that I could politely but firmly ask to leave. When I caught myself thinking, "You're such an idiot for making that mistake," I would consciously replace it with "Everyone makes mistakes. What can you learn from this one?" This required constant vigilance initially, but gradually became more automatic. The mirror became a powerful tool for practicing self-acceptance. Instead of focusing on physical flaws or inadequacies, I would look myself in the eyes and practice speaking to myself as I would to a good friend facing challenges. You're doing your best in difficult circumstances. You're learning and growing every day. You have value regardless of your imperfections. This felt artificial and uncomfortable at first because I had trained myself to believe that self-criticism was more honest than self-compassion. But I gradually realized that harsh self-judgment wasn't more accurate, it was just more familiar. The truth was that I was neither perfect nor worthless, but a flawed human being worthy of the same kindness I offered others. I began celebrating small victories and progress instead of focusing exclusively on remaining problems. When I gave a successful presentation, instead of immediately thinking about what I could have done better, I would first acknowledge what had gone well. This shift from automatic criticism to balanced assessment transformed my confidence and motivation. The practice of self-acceptance didn't make me complacent or stop striving for improvement. Instead, it gave me the emotional stability and confidence needed to take risks, learn from failures, and persist through difficulties. When you accept yourself as you are, you have the security needed to become who you want to be. I shared this approach with countless students over the years, and the results were consistently transformational. People who had been paralyzed by self-doubt became confident speakers. Individuals who had felt fundamentally flawed discovered their unique gifts and talents. The miracle wasn't that they became perfect, it was that they stopped requiring perfection from themselves. One of my most memorable students was a young woman named Jane who was convinced she was too plain and uninteresting to succeed in business. Her constant self-criticism had created a timid, apologetic demeanor that made her prediction self-fulfilling. When Jane learned to treat herself with respect and kindness, her natural intelligence and creativity began to shine through. The transformation wasn't just internal, it affected how others responded to her. When Jane stopped apologizing for her existence, people began appreciating her contributions. When she stopped highlighting her flaws, others began noticing her strengths. Self-acceptance had created the confidence that allowed her authentic self to emerge. The profound peace that comes from ending the war with yourself is immediate and lasting. When you're no longer fighting against your own nature, energy that was wasted on self-attack becomes available for growth and contribution. When you accept yourself as you are, you paradoxically become more capable of positive change, because change is no longer driven by self-hatred but by self-love. The miracle of self-acceptance is that it gives you permission to be human while inspiring you to be your best human. You don't have to wait until you're perfect to treat yourself kindly. You can start right now, exactly as you are, and discover that self-compassion is the foundation of all genuine confidence and growth. As I sit here in the twilight of my career, looking back on the journey from chronic worrier to confident teacher, I want you to understand something profound. The decision to stop worrying and start living is not a destination you reach someday. It's a choice you make today and every day for the rest of your life. The transformation I've shared with you didn't happen overnight. There were days when I slipped back into old patterns of anxiety and fear, moments when I forgot my own teachings and found myself spiraling into worry about imaginary disasters. The difference wasn't that I became perfect, but that I developed the tools and habits to quickly recognize and redirect destructive thinking before it could take root. Today, as you finish reading these words, you stand at the same crossroads I faced in that hospital bed decades ago. You can continue living as a victim of your own anxious thoughts, or you can begin implementing the strategies that will set you free. The choice is entirely yours, but I urge you not to delay. Every day you postpone this decision is another day stolen from the joy and peace that could be yours. Let me give you a practical system for beginning this transformation immediately. First, create what I call your worry elimination toolkit, a collection of specific techniques you'll use when anxiety strikes. Include my 3-step worry analysis formula, your day-tight compartment practice, and a list of productive activities that can crowd out anxious thoughts. Second, establish daily rituals that prevent worry from gaining a foothold. Begin each morning by setting your mental compartment for the day, focusing only on what you can accomplish in the next 24 hours. End each evening by consciously releasing the day's concerns and acknowledging what went well. These bookend practices will maintain your mental discipline. Third, build your personal library of peace-inducing thoughts, quotes, books, and ideas that you can access when worry threatens to overwhelm you. Remember, what you feed your mind determines your emotional state as surely as what you feed your body determines your physical health. Fourth, practice the acceptance that leads to empowered action. When challenges arise, and they will use them as opportunities to apply these principles, rather than excuses to abandon them. The goal isn't to live a problem-free life, but to navigate problems without losing your peace of mind. Fifth, surround yourself with people who support your commitment to worry-free living. Limit your exposure to chronic worriers and doom and gloom news that serves no constructive purpose. Seek out positive, solution-focused people who inspire confidence rather than anxiety. Most importantly, remember that becoming worry-free doesn't mean becoming carefree. You'll still feel appropriate concern about genuine problems that require your attention. The difference is that you'll channel that concern into productive action rather than destructive rumination. You'll be responsive rather than reactive, thoughtful rather than frantic. I've had the privilege of watching thousands of students transform their lives using these principles. Teachers who stopped dreading their classrooms and started loving their impact on young minds. Business people who stopped being paralyzed by fear of failure and started taking calculated risks that led to breakthrough success. Parents who stopped worrying constantly about their children and started enjoying the precious time they have together. The common thread in every transformation was the decision to stop waiting for worry to disappear naturally and start actively creating a worry-free mindset through daily practice. These principles work, but only if you work them consistently and persistently as you move forward. Remember that setbacks are normal and temporary. When you catch yourself falling back into worry patterns, don't compound the problem by worrying about worrying. Simply acknowledge that you're human, apply your toolkit, and get back on track. Each time you successfully redirect anxious thoughts, you're strengthening the mental muscles that will serve you for life. The legacy I want to leave is not just a collection of techniques, but a living example that ordinary people can achieve. extraordinary peace of mind through conscious choice and daily practice. You have everything you need within you right now to begin living worry-free. The only question is whether you'll choose to use it. Your worry-free future doesn't start tomorrow, next week, or when your circumstances improve. It starts today. With the very next thought you think and the very next action you take. Choose thoughts that serve you. Take actions that move you forward. Release what you cannot control. Trust in your ability to handle whatever comes. I end where I began, with the absolute conviction that you were meant to stop worrying and start living. Not someday, but today. Not when everything is perfect, but exactly as things are right now. The moment you decide to trade worry for peace, fear for faith, and anxiety for action, your real life begins. The choice is yours. The time is now. Your worry-free life is waiting.